Well, without further ado, it's my joy to welcome today Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. She serves as the research professor of English and Christian culture, Christianity and culture here at Southeastern. It's a real joy for us to have her. And I'll say she continues to be a bright spot on my social media feed just about every day. So, Dr. Pryor, if you want to join us and jump in, it'll be our joy to join you today.
Hello, I think I'm here. I'm going to try to share my screen with you and pull up a bit sort of basic outline of what I'll be talking about. So let me do that first because that's going to be the hardest part for me here today. Okay, so share screen. I think that works. And I have a slideshow here. I don't know how, okay, I don't know how to do this. We're already in trouble.
No, you're doing fine. So you click the share screen and then you pick the PowerPoint. You should have a little icon.
Oh,
There we go.
okay. And then I make it full screen.
You're perfect.
And then I do slideshow, right?
Yeah, just like you would if you were in a normal classroom. You can
I
set
never
that
use
up and
PowerPoint in the
play.
classroom, so
Yeah, that your
there we go.
playing works just perfect. There you go.
Okay. All right, thank you. So let me just preface my paper by saying that this is drawn from a chapter that is in process, actually. So I'm being a little bit selfish and strategic here because I'm really hoping that in the Q&A, you will give me some feedback on what's working in this paper and what's not working, what's confusing, and so forth. So please feel free to ask all of the questions. And the chapter is going into a large sort of encyclopedic volume that will be published by B&H Publishing on Baptist political history, which is a really big topic, obviously. And I was assigned the small task of writing about our political witness or our public witness in post-Christian America. So just that small topic. So hopefully I can give us at least some ideas about how to move forward. Let's see, not good with the PowerPoint. The first thing I just want to talk about is how we are making a transition to a post-Christian culture. We in the 21st century are going to join the majority of Christians who have lived and breathed and had their being on this earth who did not have the blessings of living in a Christian culture. But for us, our situation is a little bit different if we are alive now because we are experiencing the transition. And so that means as we enter a post-Christian culture after having been born in one that was largely, at least nominally, Christian, we are experiencing, and I'm sure you can all relate to this in different ways, we are experiencing a sense of upheaval and transition and loss and change. And so as we look at what it looks like to live in a Christian, in a culture that no longer ascribes to the values and the principles that we do, even in a nominal way, we experience a sense of loss because we can still remember what it was like to have that in a certain respect. So we are living in what the short story novelist and essay writer Flannery O'Connor, a favorite of mine, famously termed a Christ haunted culture. So to set the framework for how I want to talk about our public witness in a post-Christian culture, I want to talk about the ethical and aesthetic components of culture. So in basic terms, ethics, and of course we have a specialized sense of this word and we know what that means, but in a broader sense, especially in my field of literature, ethics very generally refers to content. So in our, thinking about our Christian ethics, it refers to what we believe or what we do. And aesthetics refers to form. So if we just think of form and content, what we believe and how we express that belief, and keep that in mind as we go throughout this, because I'm using these terms in their very broad etymological senses. So Christians living in a post-Christian culture who share very little in common ethically with our fellow citizens and our unbelieving neighbors, I want to argue, we must seek to move our neighbors, move our fellow citizens to see and desire and know the goodness and beauty of God's created order through the truth of our witness, a truth that we must embody in both word and deed. And I'll talk about this more later, but the meaning of aesthetic really is connected to movement, and that's why I want to focus on that. So first, a little bit of background, sort of the big picture of where we are now and how we got here. And so I'm just going to talk about how we are in what is this broad era called modernity, and the relationship of technology and truth to where we are. So the waning of Christian influence, I think, is best understood when we look at this broader context of where we are. And while the central event of the modern age is, as we all know, the Enlightenment, along with everything that came before and after it, modernity began, by most accounts, with the printing press, which helped to birth the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation, in emphasizing the role of the individual believer above the authority of the church or the priest or tradition, brought about what's called the turn to the subject. That's sort of the basic definition of modernity, thus marking the passage of pre-modernity into modernity. And Baptists were made by the modern age. As detailed in the Baptist story, from English sect to global movement, Baptist identity emerged in the century following the Protestant Reformation. Baptist doctrine and polity are, like those of most other Protestant denominations, although in varying degrees, rooted in the Reformation's emphasis on the primacies of the individual and the word, capital W word, and of word over image, small w and capital W, text over tradition, and a rationality rooted in the logic that we read about in John 1:1, the Logos. Baptists have always been a word-centered people, and like Baptists, America itself was the product of a reading people. So we are a people of the word as Baptists and as Christians in a post-literate culture. So we face a twofold challenge. So let me define post-literate for you. I'm drawing on a book called The Solitary Outlaw. I like this definition. Post-literacy is defined as the condition of semi-literacy, where most people can read and write to some extent, but where the literate sensibility no longer occupies a central position in culture, society, and politics. Post-literacy occurs when the ability to comprehend the written word decays. And I think we can think of all kinds of examples of where we see that ability to comprehend the written word has decayed. Cultural critics such as Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, Sven Burkertz, and Nicholas Carr have documented extensively how the shift from print culture to visual and digital cultures has given rise to this post-literacy, as well as the effects of this shift on what and how we think. Digital and social media cultivate so many streams of information now that truth and facts can be as difficult to know today as they once were when information was scarce. This problem is further compounded by the additional influx of misinformation that deliberately distorts and misleads. Ironically, the technological and economic developments that brought about widespread literacy are, or have turned out to be, the same forces which, a few centuries later, have returned us to what I like to call a new kind of dark age, wherein so much information and misinformation have cultivated an ignorance that is similar to the condition of having too little information. This post-literate condition has profound implications for us as a people of the word living in such a culture, as well as for the public sphere as a whole. The deterioration of literacy offers a twofold challenge to those of us with a word-centered faith. First, we must maintain, or perhaps even recover for ourselves, a word-centered identity within a culture that is post-literate. And secondly, we must learn how to offer effective testimony of a word-centered faith in a culture alienated or even hostile to a logos-based understanding. As a people of the word, Christians should be particularly wise and careful stewards of language, even or especially when it is being co-opted for political or market purposes. This stewardship applies not only to our own language, but to that of others as well. In an age of communication that traffics in words, an essential part of Christian witness is going to be the care with which we treat words, whether our own words or the words of others. So we'll talk a little bit about what, how, and why we believe and the connection of logos to liberty. Our witness as Christians now must be not only about what we believe, but how and why we believe what we do, our sources and their reliability, and what tangible and affective, with an A, differences those beliefs make. In a post-truth era, one in which people claim that their truth might be different from your truth, Christians must not only proclaim that there is truth, capital T truth, which is universal and unchanging, but we must also be reliable enough to be believed. Only when the words we speak are embedded in the lives that we lead, not only individually, but collectively as a church, can we earn the trust required by true authority and leading to true community. As Christians, our ethics are bound to the logos, to the unchanging nature of the created order revealed in God's law and natural law, codified in human law and moral codes. God's law, as revealed through the narrative of Scripture, does not change, although, of course, we know that our application of it throughout history has erred many times. The essentials of the faith, as worked out in the early centuries of the church and set forth in the church creeds, are also fixed. And as Baptists, we believe that our doctrinal distinctives, while not infallible, do represent our best understanding and application of biblical truth in both the life of the church and the individual believer. In fact, these Baptist distinctives, especially, I would say, soul autonomy, soul liberty, autonomy of the local church, and religious liberty, offer perhaps the best and most robust possibilities for believers living in a post-Christian culture. Our Baptist history as a persecuted church, both here in America and in Europe, and I mean in early in America, not on Twitter today, but that persecution primes us toward vigorous defenses of pluralism and religious liberty, not only for our own flourishing, but for the flourishing of our fellow citizens as well. And historically, Baptists have shunned coercion, whether in matters of conscience or worship, whether through the church or through the government, yet we have been zealous in evangelism. This is actually a most modern form of persuasion, for evangelism is an appeal to individual subjectivity about ultimate transcendent truth. So now I want to talk, I've talked a little bit about the whole modern age, a few hundred years, and now I want to go back just a couple of hundred years to talk about the eclipse of the ethical by the aesthetic. Again, ethical refers very generally to content, to belief, to idea, aesthetic to subjectivity, to feeling, to emotion. I'll unpack that a little bit more here. The trajectory of the modern age has been that of subjective experience gradually eclipsing any sense of objective reality. This history is detailed by numerous thinkers, most notably Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre, and more recently, Carl Trueman in his recent book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I'll quote from a bit here. The sharpest turn occurred toward the end of the 18th century as the age of the Enlightenment gave way to the Romantic age, and the emphasis on reason gave way to an emphasis on emotion. In other words, ethics gave way to aesthetics. Both terms name categories of value judgments. While ethics is tied to human action, which is external and objective, aesthetics is connected to sensory experience and perception, which is affective with an A, and at least initially subjective. The ethical entails acting towards some end, while the aesthetic is something experienced. Both are ultimately ways of seeing. And throughout the remainder of this talk, I will use ethics again to refer to beliefs and convictions, theological and political, that adhere through reason or the logos, and are oriented toward action or how we should live. Aesthetics is meant to suggest its foundational root of bodily sensation and movement. That's we get the word emotion from that. That's what emotion means, a moving out, as well as sensory perception, the apprehension of appearances and beauty, as well as affective responses to how we experience the world. So that's a lot, but it's all packed in to that word and that concept. While the earliest romantics at the beginning of the Romantic age at the turn of the 18th to 19th century held to an aesthetics that was infused with religious belief, as religious skepticism grew in the later 19th century, a secular aesthetics increasingly replaced religious experience. The sympathy, empathy, and compassion that form the basis of the polis, or the common good, thus became, as Carl Trueman puts it in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, he calls it functions of aesthetics rather than moral law. And as a result, sentiment and taste became the foundation for the ethical. Yet it's also important to remember that this turn toward emotion and aesthetics was itself an overcorrection to the previous reign of reason. Ultimately, though, these two components of human experience, the ethical and the aesthetic, or the reason and emotion, cannot be separated. Aesthetic experience is particular. It enables us to see and know another person or object. The ethical is universal. It enables us to see and know that each one of us belongs with the world as a whole. Ethics is tied to truth, aesthetics to love. The social imaginary of our current post-Christian culture is filled with images and ideas rooted in an aesthetics-based epistemology and ontology. And Christians are not immune to the influence of this culture. Where but from such a social imaginary did phrases such as asking Jesus into your heart, or let go and let God, or faith over fear, or sharing your heart gain traction within evangelical Christianity? It draws from the same kind of aesthetic social imaginary that we see in the Romantic age and in currently in the larger culture. If we are to meet people where they are, as Jesus did, in order to lead them where they should go, as Jesus did, we cannot ignore the social imaginary of our times. Indeed, we cannot ignore the social imaginary of our times if we are to move ourselves where we should be. We need not and must not repeat past errors of overcorrection. Indeed, to correct the course merely by attempting a nostalgic return to an earlier modern social imaginary is not only in vain, but probably in error. A love that moves. I want to begin now that I've laid the groundwork to talk about what I mean by effective witness in this kind of culture. While modern use of the word aesthetics is usually related to matters of beauty or appearance in particular, the word's origins in Greek denote sensory perceptions or emotions. Again, the root meaning of the word emotion, which includes stirring, agitation, or movement. And it later came to mean just in general feelings. At the most fundamental level, an aesthetic experience is an affective experience, one that moves us. While in the context of beauty, we would be most inclined to understand the word move metaphorically as being moved by a song, the word should be understood literally as well. To be moved by something is to experience a bodily response. It might be a quickened heartbeat, widened eyes, gathering tears, a gasp, a nod, or a smile. We are moved by what we desire, and we desire what we love, as James K.A. Smith has shown in his liturgical anthropology. Our loves and desires can be so shaped by ingrained habits that aesthetic response may not even be conscious. As Smith explains, over time, rituals and practices, often in tandem with aesthetic phenomena like pictures and stories, mold and shape our precognitive disposition to the world by training our desires. Expressions of truth undistorted by human vehicles and that therefore manifest beauty, Smith says, are what he calls aesthetic articulations of human flourishing. Effective witness to the world therefore considers not only what is true, but also how the beauty of truth will draw people toward it. As N.T. Wright states in Surprised by Hope, beauty, both that of God's creation and that made by human hands, is, quote, not simply the beauty it possesses in itself, but reflects the beauty of God's promise of what will be. And although the essentials of our faith and the word by which those essentials are revealed are unchanging, the desires or loves of those whose desires and loves we wish to move do change. To move people in the right direction requires knowing not only the destination, but also a person or a culture's current place and orientation, their starting point. As Aristotle says in The Art of Rhetoric, for things do not seem the same to those who love and those who hate, nor to those who are angry and those who are calm, but either altogether different or different in magnitude. And as Alan Jacobs argues in his excellent little book, How to Think, learning to feel as we should is enormously helpful to learning to think as we should. So now I'll talk a little bit more in depth about how language moves, rhetoric and anti-rhetoric. Because thinking relies on language, it is important to understand that while we expect the rhetoric of a well-crafted sermon or political speech or university lecture or symposium talk to move its listeners or speakers, the casual language in which we are immersed every day wields the most power to move us and cultivate our desires. As Christians, we are wise to employ this understanding of aesthetics and the power of our words to be effective witnesses for truth. In an age ruled by subjective sense rather than objective reality, people are more likely to be moved than argued toward truth. Truth needs to be shown as something embodied and lived, not merely thought. This incarnational account, which embraces the inseparability of the ethical and aesthetic components of human understanding and being, is reflected in a principle of classical rhetoric. In this tradition, what's called the ethical appeal of an argument is connected to the authority of the speaker, not only in terms of the speaker's expertise and knowledge, but also in the speaker's integrity in living in a way consistent with his argument. In other words, his moral authority. In this view, expertise and integrity, belief and the practice of that belief form the very basis of ethics. Likewise, effective public witness of Christians in a post-Christian America will begin with the conformity of our professed beliefs to our lived beliefs, and with the integrity of our private lives and our communal church lives. This, of course, has always been true, but the necessity of our own integrity and the absence of hypocrisy for our witness is even more crucial in a culture that does not share our worldview or our ethics. We certainly cannot expect those who don't share our assumptions to give those assumptions credit when we fail to live by them ourselves. The aesthetics of language. The truth which language conveys, plus its, quote, artful presentation, the words of Richard Weaver, its aesthetic power, in other words, is called rhetoric. Rhetoric, Richard Weaver argues in his work called The Ethics of Rhetoric, is something which creates an informed appetition for the good. An informed appetition is another way of expressing the connection between reason or ethics and affect or aesthetics. Part of living in a post-literate dark age is the abundance of anti-rhetoric in the form of clickbait, hot takes, and viral takedowns, which are really just postmodern forms of the ancient art of sophistry, all of which help create an uninformed or malformed appetition not for good, but for evil. Christian witness in such an age must resist participation in what Weaver calls anti-rhetoric. Weaver goes so far as to say that a man's method of argument is a truer index of his beliefs than his explicit profession of principles. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's powerful. A man's method of argument is a truer index of his beliefs than his explicit profession of principles. In other words, the method of argument cannot be separated from the argument. The character of a person is revealed in how she witnesses. This is, again, the ethical appeal, an embodied incarnational understanding of not only formal argument, but effective witness that is effective because its power is in being lived. To witness dialogically in hopes of, again, moving our neighbor is to participate in the political. It is to be political. Dialogue can be pursued and understood as the locus of personal, public, and political witness. Pursuit of religious liberty in a post-Christian culture requires in the words of Andrew Walker, the editor of this volume that I'm contributing to, an ethic of humble truth-seeking and expecting deep, an ethic of humble truth-seeking that expects deep disagreement. Such an ethic, Walker says, places interrogation, debate, and liberty at the forefront of settling disputes over religious, moral, and ideological difference, and urges patience, persuasion, and a limited view of the state's power to play referee regarding religious truth claims. This necessity for a dialogical posture of believers toward an unbelieving world is affirmed by Leslie Newbigin. Even a confession or an ethic is a kind of movement or aesthetic in Newbigin's understanding. He says there is no dichotomy between confession and truth-seeking. Such a dialogical approach, in fact, constitutes the Christian ethic because, he says, even as Christians, we do not possess the truth in an unassailable form. Thus, in the very act of engaging in dialogue, particularly with those outside the faith, we make ourselves vulnerable. Such vulnerability is both an ethic and an aesthetic. It's a posture and it's a belief. The power of language to persuade, going back to Richard Weaver, he says, its basis in what that person loves. Persuasive speech is aesthetic in that it can move us toward what is good. It can move us toward what is evil, or it can fail to move us at all. The way we use language moves for good or ill. Faithful witness must begin with love. Not love of winning or power or access or influence for the sake of influence, but genuine love for God and neighbor. It should go without saying, but it cannot. Love is clearly defined in the Bible. Love is patient. It is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. Dialogue with another, whether another individual or between a Christian people and a non-Christian people, is a recognition of the experience of others and of our own humility in the limitation of our own understanding. Only in that posture of humility can we speak truth with what Dante describes in his final beatific vision in the Divine Comedy, with a love that moves. Thank you.